If your bobbin runs out or your top thread breaks, it's really easy to return to the spot your stitching stopped and start again. As with all of our video tutorials for QuiltPath, remember there are many ways to accomplish the same thing, so experiment and find the way you like best. If you have your QuiltPath top thread break detector activated, the QuiltPath program will stop stitching if it detects a broken top thread. If your bobbin runs out, you need to tap Stop to bring QuiltPath to a halt. QuiltPath will not bring your machine to a stop after your bobbin runs out. You'll need to do that yourself by tapping the Stop button. Next, tap Repair Pattern. You may want to tap the Release the Carriage button next, so you can move the machine more freely in order to replace your bobbin or rethread your machine. Once you have your bobbin replaced or your top thread ready to go, you'll want to identify where in the line of stitching you'd like to restart. Most of the time, it is easier to hide restarts in a point, and it is easier to double-check your restart alignment in a point as well. First, locate a point or a change of direction just preceding where your bobbin ran out or your top thread broke. You may need to unsew a small portion of the stitching line, as the last few inches may have loose tension if your bobbin thread ran out. We want to pick a section where the top and bottom stitches are well formed. When identifying where you'd like to restart stitching, try to avoid restarting over a long line segment that may not fully align due to fabric draw-up, which naturally occurs as you add more and more stitches to a quilt top. Anytime we add stitches while quilting, the quilt sandwich will naturally draw up a bit. Because of this natural shifting, we will want to double-check our alignment when restarting after a thread break. Once you've identified where you'd like to restart, we'll need to move the machine to that position. There are a few ways to do this. For now, we'll use the closest stitch feature, but you could also use the Trace Backwards or Trace Forwards button. Hover your machine's needle over the spot you'd like to resume stitching. Tap on Closest Stitch. You'll see QuiltPath move your machine slightly, and if you watch the screen, you'll notice that the dark blue line, which indicates what we've already stitched, changes. Now, everything before the location of this point is dark blue, to signify that it has been stitched. Everything in front of this needle position turns light blue, to signify that we still need to stitch that area. As we discussed earlier, restarting in a point or where a pattern goes in a new direction is generally a good idea to best hide our stops and starts. To be sure you are in a point, you may need to tap Trace Back 1 or Trace Forward 1 until you reach a point. Watch and wait until the machine abruptly changes direction, and you'll know you've found the point. You can also use the Trace Plus and Trace Minus buttons to move the machine's needle so it is sitting right in your desired location. It may help to use the flywheel on your machine to lower the needle ever so slightly so you can see exactly where QuiltPath will be stitching. Locate your flywheel on the left front side of your machine. Turn the wheel clockwise toward the ceiling to lower your needle to make sure it is right on top of your point. If your needle isn't aligned exactly where you want it, turn the flywheel counterclockwise just enough to keep the needle from rubbing on your fabric. Then use the nudge buttons to move the machine ever so slightly until the needle is on the point. You can use Trace Forward and Trace Backward to double-check your alignment until you're happy with the placement. Finally, once you have checked your alignment and are happy with everything, use the Trace buttons to return the needle to the exact starting point where you want to begin restitching. Before we get restarted, let's double-check what you have entered for your tie-off stitch count. Tap on the Options menu to take a look at the setting. The tie-off stitch count is the number of stay stitches the machine will take at the beginning of a stitching line. I like to keep mine on about a 4. However, if you prefer to knot and bury your thread tails, keep the tie-off stitch count at 0. In this case, QuiltPath will bring the bobbin thread to the top, but you'll hold onto the tails so you can knot and bury your thread tails later. For me, I will typically only knot and bury quilts that are to be entered into competition, so I normally use tacking stitches or stay stitches when restarting more utilitarian quilts. You may prefer a different approach. Tap on OK. Because I'm restarting just behind where the thread broke, I'll have stay stitches on top of both the old line of stitching and the new line of stitching, which will secure my threads nicely. When I'm using thread that blends into the quilt top, the stops and starts aren't that noticeable. Okay, we've got our machine positioned, our bobbin pulled, and we're ready to restart our stitching. Hold on to the thread tails and tap sew. That's it. Depending on the quilting density level in your design, you may want to keep your hands near the restart point to maneuver the fabric slightly to be sure the new stitching line lies back on top of the existing stitching line. Be aware that leaning on the backing bar can shift the quilt sandwich and affect the accuracy of your stitching line. So try not to lean on the backing bar when using repair pattern or when stitching out the pattern. Repairing a pattern after a thread break is easy with QuiltPath.